out of the UPC this afternoon. Taking Kant's maxim, the categorical imperative, Léon Krier has adopted a way of acting, as it were, as if the architect's work should be considered a paradigm. And that's as a maxim that should underline the work of the architect. And for this reason, his work transcends the necessity of producing a master plan, producing a building, in order to become reflections on the essence of the city and the nature of the architectural object. Over the years, Léon has designed master plans for several capitals, including his native Luxembourg, Stockholm, West Berlin, London, and a very ambitious project for the completion of Washington, D.C. Recently, he designed Guatemala, a new master plan for a new capital of Guatemala. And he gave this master plan to his students at Yale, each of which was supposed to develop some of the buildings of the master plan. And this is the subject of the lecture this afternoon. Please welcome again to Notre Dame, Léon Krier.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to have such an audience. We didn't expect anybody apart from ourselves. It was such a difficult day preceding the presentations. But I always try to reduce my carbon footprint coming here by giving a lecture. I was not asked to give a lecture. I give a lecture because I asked to give one, not just to have reviews. Guatemala was, because I'm involved in a master planning, a new extension of Guatemala City. And so I know the Guatemala City now for 12 years. And the city has enormous problems of commuting and public transport, so much so that in 2003, 1 million people every day traveled into the center, and 12 years later, there is now 2 million traveling every day to the center from the periphery, meaning that the roads are terribly congested and unhealthy. And yet it does not have really, it's a city which is profoundly divided. This is a general introduction, which maybe you have seen these images, which is really to militate against the basic tendencies which transform our cities nowadays, and to which there seems to be little resistance, which is that there is now a lot of awareness that horizontal sprawl is extremely problematic and is very difficult to justify in ecological terms. But I think that vertical sprawl is equally difficult to justify because it's so highly dependent on fossil fuels. But the general thesis is not about fossil fuel, but I say that even if we had fossil fuel forever and there was no limit to extraction, we should still go back to traditional urbanism, because traditional urbanism and the scale which is imprinted in this urbanism is really the human scale, whereas the scale which dictates sprawl, vertical or horizontal sprawl, is machine scale. And it is human scale which we should go back to, which should be the foundational measurement of cities. So that we suffer two forms of overexpansion in modern cities. One is vertical overexpansion, while horizontal overexpansion, instead of expanding cities by multiplying limited centers, complex and compact centers. I don't think I have to go too much through this, because I mean, this is the only school in the world where people are supposed to know these data. But this is a plan which shows the extraordinary difference between human scale, say traditional towns, whether it's around beginning of our time, Timgad in Africa, or Brive in France, or central Paris. Then you see already 19th century, end of 19th century in Berlin, an explosion of scale. The blocks, instead of being the size which you have in historic towns, they grow extremely large. In the expansion of Kreuzberg in Berlin, you have already blocks which are 350, 400 meters wide, long and 100 meters wide, having a much impoverished street network. And then the socialist expansion of Vienna, Karl Marx, a very famous example, which is taught in every architecture school. 1 kilometer of building done by one architect, which is exactly the length. You could put this over the center of historic Vienna and it would go just all across the historic center of Vienna. And then National Socialism, Albert Speer, and then Corbusier's Plan Voisin and Villeradieu's and post-war Saint-Dié. And when you look at these, they are like different choices of form, of plans, of networks, but they are particularly, they have an imprint on the ground. And in order to do these totalitarian schemes, these enormous, repetitive, and often single-use zones, you need extraordinary large pieces of land. Whereas when you see the traditional European city, or even traditional American city, was created on a very rich variety, dimensional, functional, and symbolic variety of building lots, large, medium, and small, forming neighborhoods of good urban space, and with a great mixture of functions, incomes, races, symbols, and it is this density, this neighborliness of very rich variety of functions and meanings and people and ages, which creates a richness of historic centers, and which are our model to design towns. And it is ironic that it is now, in situations where we have such enormous pieces of land. I do a town in England, the Poundbury for the Prince of Wales, and we have this kind of a piece of land or other large estates in Guatemala, where now the owners of this enormous piece of land are aware that you cannot go on with this system, and that is actually, when you have such a piece of land, that you have a choice where you can actually design again this kind of town and then sell. No, it's really a form, how these grow is a form of management, that you sell the lots in the way that what the market requires, and you place them there where they make most sense. So it's not really a planned economy, it's management economy, which is different from what is done now. Guatemala City is this extraordinary spread of several million people who are built, most of the sprawl or even the center are built on these mesas or mesetas, these very large table mountains divided by very deep canyons. And the network of these streets is conceived in such a way now for 200 years that you are hardly aware of these canyons, which are an extraordinary geographic feature and an extraordinary chance for a town to develop on. But because by a mistake of planning, you don't have really this awareness, because there are no Corniche roads, there are no border avenues, there are no boulevards accompanying this. So that's one major problem. The other major problem is that Guatemala City, just the center here, that was a historic town, then expanded over these mesas. It's very poor network of roads, and actually the Pan American Highway crosses right through the center. And then you have these canyons which cut deep into the fabric. Now the city is also socially extremely divided, in that the historic center, what used to be the historic center, is almost completely taken over by indigenous population and by tourism. And the more wealthy middle classes live in separate, often gated communities. And I'm developing together with Maria Sanchez and Pedro Godoy, who are graduates of Notre Dame. We developed now for 12 years this master plan for Cayala, And this is a part which is now being completed, and we are now starting this area. And this is the center, it's about 4 kilometers from the center. And it's by traveling there that I became extremely aware of this Krier, which is now under construction. 3,000 workers were on site in 2010. And most of it is being built, which the Economakis designed. The main building there with these enormous steps. And it has become like a new historic center. So it has become a model, a very powerful model for how the city could develop. And we had 6 months ago a seminar also with Richard Economakis and the team, and Maria and Pedro, to plan a new quarter. And we have now a much better relationship with the surrounding authorities or the surrounding areas, so that it becomes now easier to integrate also areas like the American school or the university, which were excluded. Some of these, I won't go much into this, but it's just to give you a flavor of what's happening already there. This is the cathedral, which is designed by Pedro and Maria, which is now under construction. The building started in 2010, and that major avenue is now almost complete. When we arrived, I did this project with students at Yale. When we arrived, the owner he had finished this little hotel, so we lived in this hotel on the Plaza Mayor, the cinema, the tower of the Campanario of the cathedral, and this area where we're expanding now. And that was 10 years ago. It was impossible to talk to the university. Now that they see the realization of the first quarter, they are much more willing to participate. And I was brought up like Catholic and Christian, so I recall them, their duty as Catholics and as Christians to build the Christian city, because that is really the modern city, is the Christian city, which integrates the different classes and the different races and the different incomes and the different rivalries in one social body, which is the traditional city, I think. And I call this it's a Jesuit university, so I call this the Ignacio de Loyola Tower. And that's the American school. And we're expanding now here. And that's part of the new expansion. So, I said before, the historic center is here. The Guatemala City was founded in the beginning of the 19th century to move Antigua, the old capital city, because Antigua had been destroyed 3 times by earthquakes, and so they established, and by volcanic eruptions, in this area, which was relatively safe. Then you have 19th century and 1900 and expansions, and you have in between the historic center and the 19th century expansion, you have an area which is called Centro Cívico. And that is where I decided to do a master plan for a new capital city because of this enormous influx and commuting. And Guatemala City doesn't really have a good road network. It would be to create a new capital city in the center to become a model of how the rest of the town and of the country should be developed. Because it can't be entirely, this is the Leal property, which we are master planning, but it can't be it's not really the calling of private owners to do master planning, because naturally they have only to fulfill private interest, whereas doing a master plan for a city must be, you must be like a legislator who is independent of the different incomes and classes and ideological interests, because you are designing a pattern of building sites. which has to be good for many, many generations and decades. So it must transcend private interests, and it must really work. It's one of the major instruments to do public good, if such a thing exists. I mean, I know many people doubt that such a thing exists. And it's to change this enormous metropolis, which is now 21 zones, into over 160 urban quarters, of which the center would then be the new capital city. Now, there's very interesting because the center is occupied now by an Olympic stadium and about 10 different towers, which were built in the 1970s under the dictatorship of General Aranya. And it is very interesting because we can now play what modernists said, you know, accusing classism of being a product of totalitarianism. Well, here, totalitarianism produced modernist buildings. And they are for us, or we can say, we don't quite mean it, but we return the knife and say, these are symbols of a terribly bloody dictatorship, which was not only terribly bloody, but started really the civil war, which lasted something like 30 years. And that they have become the symbol of injustice. This is a justice, Ministry of Justice. Does that look like justice to you? I don't know. This was a group from my Yale students who traveled there, many nations, many extraordinary talents who had never designed the classical building before. And you see that it's not exactly civic space which you find there. And this is the central avenue, this is the epicenter of the town. It's either empty on this Sunday or congested, like you have to wear a gas mask. Because I decided that we demolished these 21 buildings, skyscrapers, as an act of revenge, cold revenge. We are taking them down as they took down beautiful cities. And I thought there was one building which was a little more elegant. We preserved that as a historic building of past age, as an example of the past, put it in aspect. It turned out that that building was the most fragile and had to go the first. And then I found out that all these buildings, which I had condemned and felt already quite guilty about it, have to come down within the next 10 years because they didn't comply with seismic legislation. So in a way, this act of revenge was not really a revenge, but is a function of necessity. Now, there's an official plan, which is called Plan de Ordenación Territorial, POT, which legislates that the future of Guatemala City is going to be changed by having a dense corridor of skyscrapers, 23 kilometers of skyscrapers going right through town and forming a kind of network through town, which is supposed to be accompanied by public transport. And they interpret this, or they explain this as if this was influenced by Andres Duane's transect. Of course, it's complete misreading of the transect, which is not the linear affair. And as you can see, this is the area of the project. It condemns all these existing skyscrapers anyway. So contrition doesn't need to be so painful as I thought. That's the area: Olympic Stadium, Justice Palace, Ministry of Finance, National Theatre. And there's a drop of about 20 meters from over a kilometer. The idea is this Nîmes in France, where you have the historic center, is insulated by a linear boulevard in the Roman stadium here, Roman arena, which makes the historic center perfectly readable, like an object. And Lucien and I, we grew up in Luxembourg. I grew up with this kind of town, which was very much like Guatemala City geographically, because it has these deep canyons. And it's this idea that the large town is a family of small towns, and that in the spaces between, you have a hierarchy of spaces which is geographic, of a geographic scale, like very large rivers or parks, or areas which forms sizes of public spaces which can take in, which can be the location of buildings which are of national importance, because they are so readable and so open that they can be really deliver areas where you build very important national buildings, whereas inside each quarter you have more local affairs. Now, so you create this void. You have a linear and circular mall, 150 meters wide, and you can get then this new town, Guatemala, which is a composition of Maya and Guatemala, and it's composed of two different quarters. One is the federal city, and one is the civic city, because you have the municipality would form one head, and the parliament building, the new parliament building, the other, and then the executive square and justice square. They are very much influenced by the federal, by L'Enfant's plan for Washington, which has this triangulation of the three powers, major powers. And then all these major buildings are on axes with major avenues. So that is where the justice system or the executive mansion or the parliament would always sit on very large. So they become, already the locations are very significantly visible. You have a park surrounding, this mall becomes a park, except where those major buildings are sited. You have very hard mineral squares fronting them and displaying the building, creating a certain distance of them and to them, but also allying in a way the grandeur, the sublimity of public buildings, which needs to have a certain altitude in relationship to society, but also on the other hand be intimately married to an urban fabric, not to have this kind of gaping fora which you find in Brasilia or in Chandigarh. So, this is topography. Now students had the choices of three styles and three methods, three architectural systems to emulate. One was Antigua, Guatemala, which is a perfect town which has been beautifully restored over the last decades. And so they had to, the student who chose this mode had to do kind of lexicon of that town. One was Otto Wagner and one was Corbusier, because I still think that we traditionalists have to reform modernism, because modernism is not being reformed by modernists. They don't know how to do it. They don't have the technique, they don't have the will, they don't have determination. So we have to occupy that terrain to see if that is part of our reality, and it is. You travel around the world, most buildings are nowadays modern, so, and they are not getting any better. So we have to do that kind of dirty work. And actually it can be quite fun, because a language can be, it's like an Esperanto which you have to develop. But imagine only for a moment if that building would disappear. No, Washington would be without this dome. The mall or the Pennsylvania Avenue. Whenever you open American television, American news, CNN, you have this building. It's one single building which concentrates and really becomes a symbol of the public, of the American public polity, of polity of the America. And that is the object of what students have to do. One public building, which has this kind of power to create a very powerful icon for the nation. And the other one is to design a residential block, a palafito, as we call it. Now, I always have students at Yale who never had classical architecture, except sometimes people who come from Notre Dame, but they are very rare. And so within 3 months, we have 1 month of analysis and then 2 months of project. And one way to explain for students to begin to understand what classicism is about. What is classical? What are we talking about when we talk of classical proportions, you can experience this by exaggerating it. And it's a method which you can learn when you observe how a musical instrument is tuned. That first of all, you have strings which you over tense and then come down to the correct, to the tempered sound. And when it's correct, you know that it's correct. There's no way everybody hears what is a correct sound or what is a tune which is out of tune. With architecture, it's not so precise. The eye is not so precise as our hearing. When you see bad proportions, it doesn't really, you don't feel pain, aggressive pain like you hear when you have a wrong note. You know, it's really, it's horribly torturing. And so we have to, the students have to take a column or a vase or a car, anything they like, or even a person, put it on the digitally on the computer, and then begin to stretch it or compress it. And it is through this change, either of the vertical dimensions, these are the same elements for all the 6 columns you see here, the same number of elements, but the proportions change here, the vertical dimensions, and here the horizontal dimensions. And you have an enormous variety. You see, with the same elements, you have an enormous variety of character which is expressed. And these different characters, you can name them. And by experiencing this, the student begins to understand what is really a classical proportion, or why this is something which you can repeat more often than that one or this one. This is making it anorexic. Now, this is not to establish a dogma of what is right and wrong, but to really see the very large range of possibilities and see what kind of proportions, what kind of character applies to what kind of function or to what kind of use. Then these are very short exercises. Then students have to measure up a classical building, generally of the Yale campus. Here's an example of historic society at Yale, at New Haven. And that's the building, the way the building exists. They have to extract, make a lexicon, like you do often here in school, of the different parts, and then modify these or recompose with the same elements. These are exercises which take, when you use a computer, can do that in a few hours. And it's an extraordinarily interesting learning experience, I think, to understand what is classical, and particularly to get this idea of a lexicon that you can, once you have that discipline, you can go anywhere in the world. And these are the parts you find in any part of the world, and just then record what is the typical material or stylistic or characteristic expressions and elements which make up a regional architecture. And of course, and then identify what is pure construction, what is pure tectonic, and what is where art comes in, what is an artistic interpretation of this tectonic technical construction language. And then be aware of how much architecture do you need to be happy. You don't need to have this kind of excessive exaggeration. That may be interesting for the World Exhibition like it was in Chicago, 1893, but you can't build the whole world like that. And that is where I think Kant comes in really as an example that behave in such a way that the principle of your behavior could become principle of general law. And if we apply that to architecture, if you imagine that people, Gaudi is very loved and probably successful architect, kilometers of queues in Barcelona to look at Casa Milà. But imagine not only one building of Gaudi, an entire block, an entire district, an entire town, an entire region, an entire province, an entire country, an entire continent designed like Gaudi. It's a madhouse. And that is where classical architecture is an extraordinary invention. It's an artifice, but it's an artifice which is properly human, which only humans exist. And that is why Hannah Arendt says, that's why because it's artificial that we feel so familiar with it, because it's properly human. I start now with the student projects. The student who had Otto Wagner who had to codify Otto Wagner, and he designed. We have in the middle the tetrapylon, which is this. Now you have in Roman towns where the Cauda and Decromanus, where they cross, they have often a tetrapylon, 4 pylons which carry a roof over the crossing, and we developed this into a very large covered plaza, 80 by 80 meters and 50 meters high. So it's superhuman scale. It's cathedral type mega scale, which can become then like a house for the society. Now, the historic center here is completely occupied by indigenous people, and the middle classes don't go there. Middle class generally live in gated communities, and our development, KLI, is the first new urban development which is open. It's not gated, and it becomes really a space where the different populations meet again. Even if the poor, the lower middle class can't afford to be there, but this becomes a model of congregation, of urban congregation. And this would have to be, therefore, a public model, how these different classes, which were at war for 30 years, how they can meet again and form a real civil society, which lives in a pleasurable and orderly way. So the students had to do this tetrapylon, and then campanile, which becomes a vertical marker to make place and an urban palacito. Now, in this case, Neil, he used Patrick Schumacher's famous parametric system to design these funny buildings, which you see now published everywhere. And he applied this to Otto Wagner. I have no means of controlling it, but it worked, because by the push of a button, he could produce 150 of these blocks in a minute. And they are remarkable. So every single one has an essential patio staircase. They must not be more than 3 floors plus a penthouse, and form the basic urban fabric with an individual car park or collective car park. But it's also to have a great variety of building lots, so not only very large investments develop very large buildings, but you can have, again, small family-type investments to develop, to make urban blocks like was common. It's really a building type, this Palazzina is a building type which built most of modern Rome. It's a fantastic way of living. You have generally 4 flats per floor, and usually the living room on the corner with large terraces and so on. Altair was a young woman, had enormous social skills, very attractive person, but she says, I have no talent, architectural talent. I've been told to do history, that sort of thing. And she decided that we don't have the municipality here, but she reverted the order, and I agreed, because this is the lower part, this higher part, so the parliament would now be here, and the municipality there to be closer to the historic center. And because she said she had no talent, she has no knowledge of classicism, she did very good drawings of historic buildings, but she had no versatility yet in doing that. So I said, well, one of the ways is to use fascist or, and I don't say this lightly, I mean fascist not as politics, but fascist architecture in Italy was very interesting in the 1930s. So stripped down, it was like compromise between the traditional architecture and modernism, very stripped down volumetric architecture, but which allows people who have not yet done classicism to do it correctly, because it's very simple. So you can start that way and then slowly only design things you have already understood, what they mean and why you should use them. And she did this remarkable municipality, which I think is really for a person who says it's without talent. And but when you get these very simple volumes right and the proportions right, then later you can also develop this more architecturally in a more decorous way. But I think it's very important to get first these ideas correct. Or this Chinese student who designed our White House here, Casablanca, with the executive mansion, with executive gardens and the offices, the West Wing, and so on. And they also have to do. I think you do also analytics here, which I find a very interesting way to have in one illustration all the characters and characteristics and elements of a single building. And of course, these buildings, she used the theme, this bridge I showed you from the nunnery in Antigua. And instead of having just a bridge, she turns it into a tetrapylon, which then sits on the roof and is on the major axis of Reforma Avenue. And so it becomes highly visible throughout the town. Again, these are the residential blocks with an underground car park. And here you have the case where you have 6 blocks or 8 small blocks. They are about 20 by 25 meters, with 4 apartments per floor. And this is a very large development. So you have a unified car park with the ramps are always in the form of an arcade. So the ramp of the car park is like an arcade in which you walk in, but here you drive in. So it's an attractive feature instead of being just a dark hole in the ground or an unpleasant scar in a building. But this would already be quite considerable investment. This Adrienne Brown, she's from Chicago. She worked then after this. She had never designed a classical building, but I think this is remarkable. She designed here the Parliament building. Now she also changed the position to this is the highest point in town. The main street comes up, rises up. It is like a platform. She designed this building and the Parliament. It was very much inspired from the university building in Antigua. But by exaggerating this, she used that, what is that called? The multi-centered archer, I forget the funny term. And, but she exaggerated in almost in a surreal way. So you enter through this very vast arch into this courtyard, and then accede to the rotunda and the different chambers. And these are students who never designed a classical building before. This, after 2 months of getting into it. And it's remarkable because that is what architecture is completely different from spoken language. It's a language which is technical, and which can be acquired without accent. Whereas when you learn language, you will forever carry, you are marked by your original language. And this was Anne Morrow. She was, I see, she was a business major. She came only to my seminars, didn't participate in the project 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before she decided to do a project. And she designed this in 3 weeks next to the apartment. And on the corner of this new town, northwestern corner, we have like a national cathedral. As you probably understand, there's a lot of reference to L'Enfant's original plan for Washington, but the idea to have a national cathedral which allows all the different ideological and theological and religious diverging world views, but to be symbolized by a single building. I think it's at least once, it shouldn't happen everywhere. I mean, I don't think religious services should be in tennis courts and casinos, but at least there should be one major kind of national temple which takes care of that kind of human longing, whatever the historic visions and divergences are. And that was, of course, a student who studied Otto Wagner and also designed these civic residential buildings. And then the most problematic, one Chinese student used Corbusier as an, and particularly Corbusier's Chandigarh elements, buildings, but to design a real urban fabric and a parliament building and the residential block with these very large villas, these L-shaped villas with big terraces. I think it would work very well. It would certainly be much better than what modernism has produced so far. And then this other tetrapylon, which is, I think, interesting that she uses, Chinese student who uses similar elements but at different scales. She also, you see later the Campanarium. She uses the same forms but at very different scale. You see here again John Farage's cathedral. And then Art Deco was also one of the styles which I think it's really the last articulate architectural style which was developed around the world without any theory, without any declaration, ideological declarations, without any kind of fanatical texts and it's extraordinary how such a very specific style developed within something like 5 or 6 years and spread around the world. And I think it's well worth studying it and making it systematic because it's one way to enter into the world of classicism, often extremely attractive with very, very few elements. And one of the problems of this style, of this mode, and also with modernism, is that it doesn't have really regional differences. And regional differences are defined by climate, by altitude, and by material. Funnily, the Art Deco is the same in New Zealand or in Miami Beach or in Antigua. There are buildings like that, and even here and in Russia. And it is much more difficult to really signify regional differences, which I think it's important when we start thinking of architecture as a language which is not just for one building or for one town, but has to be meaningful if applied generally. This is a justice court which is on the southern center. And this was our best man who has he was told that he was told that he had no talent. And he had been convinced by then that he had no talent. And he thought he's going to become a developer, went also to business school. And within 3 months, he became the best student. And he was even nominated for a big prize, and he became an associate in Robert Stern's office. And he has now his own jobs. And the extraordinary man who had absolutely no skill in designing, he had virtually no portfolio, within 3 months produced this kind of work. And that is the incredible advantage of classicism. That is a language you can really learn very quickly, and you can, if you understand the logic, you can do very fine buildings within no time, and you become even a better modernist. Because you know how to dosing, how to differentiate, what needs to be high, what needs to be low. You have a vision of how the cities should be articulate, what is important, what is not. And so this is the residential block with a private car park under the building. And then the justice court and the judicial system in several buildings which form like a small campus on axis with Reforma again. And unfortunately, we were missing the overall perspectives which integrate all but sometimes you see buildings of other students which have been integrated. So I was extremely happy with this kind of work. I'll now show you, just to finish, things I'm working on now is I have been working for Seaside in Florida for Tower for 35 years. We've done 150 versions of it, always for different urgencies. We need now this and that. And finally, it looks like we are going to get it built. It's a tower on which all major avenues in Seaside radiate towards, and has been promised in many brochures and publicity. And now finally it may happen. And it has now become a telecom tower, and it's going to be 4 telecom companies who are going to be lodged in this tetrapylon, which sits on top. And then you have markets here, market stalls, stores, but they have this airstream. You know the airstreams? And the airstreams are now parked along the road. They already make a lot of money for rotators. And but I thought it looks rather tedious and unsightly and a bit honky-tonk. And so by disciplining them, you have those parked with the activity in between, but they sell in the space in between. And they're actually delightful objects. Huh? So some of these, the tower is now, it has a lot of elements of Art Deco, for instance, and this is out of experience because I tried to do deep joints in another building in Miami, and never get them. Always like a 1/10 of an inch deep, whereas a serious joint needs to be, at least for public building, 2 inches tall and one minimum of 1 inch deep. So we decided we have an aluminum profile running in these channels, and we have stucco lustro or polished stucco, and the balconies are also in polished aluminum, and the roof, everything is aluminum or stucco. So it's very, very different from the character of the houses or the commercial buildings. And it's really, I think that public buildings should be really highly distinct from other matters in order to stand out as public structures. And then we have fountain here because this is 31A. It's a very important road going past the beaches. The white sand beaches are here. There's a piazza open to the ocean, and these buildings are designed by Carlo Bontempi. And the fountain would be here to slow down the traffic. This is a fountain I had in 9 projects so far, in Spain, in Italy, in France, in Guatemala. It was never built. There were always other reasons why not to build it. And so I put in every one of my projects, but now finally it will be built in England. We have it already, it's already cast. Fountains are countryless. And there you see the airstreams. We have very attractive back, so that will be exposed to the, and you have here a niche. So you have elements of modernity, B29 modernity, no, Michael? With rivets, polished rivets. And that is a door which will slide away and allow the high-tech material to be shipped inside. And so on. It's very Otto Wagner. Huh? I was brought up by Corbusier, but then converted to Otto Wagner. The strongest emotions I ever had was with Otto Wagner. I nearly fainted seeing his dam in Nussdorfer Damm, or his church in Kirche am Steinhof. You have to go see it. It's restored. It's like out of this world. And that's the roof. Chinese, huh? It's like a Chinese carpentry, radiating from one point. And see there. And you come in, you turn, and then it goes around this point. Here you have the thick wall with very deep windows. And my brother will sculpt 4 aluminum figures for this stoop. The steps are already done. The trees are planted. And this is a project where your dean, Michael Likoudis, was involved in 20 years ago. 10 years ago. And the developer asked me to do a veterans memorial, and with very high obelisk. So I gave him not only one obelisk but 4, and it is on highway going past along the coast of the Mexican Gulf. I mean, it's near Pensacola. Very heavy traffic here. And then there also one would pave over this highway. Apparently the mayor likes the idea, another fountain there, and in the median. And then the monument would be like a triangular base, oversized stones, enormous pieces of blocks of coral stone and irregular steps. Then this 80 meters high, half as high as the Washington Memorial. And inside there would be like a crypt and an eternal flame on this triangular base. I don't know whether the client is, but I will be luckier with him than Michael was. But there was, Michael's project was, how many houses were there? About 30 houses in the square. And unfortunately, the ocean is here, and opposite this village, Tannin village is called, is now 100-meter high condominium, so it would be nowhere overpowering. I think that's the end of it. This is something which I think could be done here in the school, by at least could be a regular exercise. Because I showed this already here, but I show it every time because I think it's an idea which could change America. You have the typical American grid. In every American town, you have this gridiron plan, this Jeffersonian plan. And I noticed that I was driving with a friend in San Diego, and suddenly there were very, very nice, fine buildings standing on this avenue, but you didn't notice them because they're on this avenue. You always drive past, and it's like beautiful buildings parked on the side of a street. In order for a significant building to gain significance, it must not only be significant and beautiful and have an important function, but at some point be an important focus, visual focus of the urban grid. And this could be, you could take any rundown corner in a suburb and change just, have the traffic either, instead of crossing, having 2 T-junctions, or get the traffic around here and pedestrianize this center and move the tower, instead of being on the side, move it into center, and then have like a couple of plazas. And I think by this simple technique, once that is done and well published, it will just spread around the country and change. It could change a lot of suburbs because it's very difficult to give significance by buildings in the suburb which is purely organized on a gridiron plan. So you need to have an intervention which moves something into focus. That's it. Thank you.
If you have questions, I think Léon, thank you.
I am American Studies and a student, so I actually have little or no background in architecture at all, but I'm very curious as to what role local actors might play in like the vision of this plan, and if you have any experience from your travels in terms of discussing what some local residents might have to say about these ideas.
I've become very weary of local residents. Because I think local residents, and particularly residents' organizations, are very powerful in stopping things, and really should be organized to stop unpleasant and aggressive developments. But when it comes to really planning new things or changing plans for existing things, it's a tedious way of doing it, because people generally don't know about planning. And when they come to planning seminars, you need a very good technique to master the different egos. And I know that within New Urbanism, there is a technique which is developed, is the charrettes, which work very well, because you have a technique where you bring in not just any resident, but residents who are already representing others. They do not just speak in their own voice, but they become more like citizens rather than individual neighbors. Neighbors are a disaster worldwide. That is a law. It's a universal law. Neighbors are absolutely awful. They're just interested in their, not only now in their backyard, but in their front yard. We planned, Professor Steil, he was working as consultant for Luxembourg Road Building Authority, who had been cutting trees for 30 years, and then they brought us back to replant the roads. And my own mother, a musician and very sensitive person, and she loved beauty, she created an association of the road she lived in to stop the tree planting, which Lucien had planned. This was 40 years ago. You know, because neighbors are terrible, terrible persons. Neighbors who behave as neighbors should never be allowed to have public voice. They have to be representative of a larger interest. And that is what we call citizens. That they are not just neighbors. And in England, there's a term NIMBYism, but I now call it not in my backyard, now it's not in my front yard either. And I think one should really plan cities without citizens. Because we are the experts. We know how to design good cities. We don't need any help. Otherwise, we shouldn't be architects. Because we live, the most beautiful cities were designed by people who never asked our opinion, and we choose to live there because they are Rome or great cities. Paris were planned without our opinions. We love it because they were done the right way. And that's, we now, unfortunately, we inherited the rage which should have gone against the bad planning or the criminal planning 40 years ago. I had just a beautiful scheme stopped in England by neighbors. We'll win in the end because we take them to court. But or seaside, the development of seaside is slowed down by 5 or 6 neighbors who have gone completely bananas, try to stop everything, and think that Robert Davis is their public enemy. Number one, it's a human theater and comedy, and needs to be managed extremely carefully, not to be out of control. And there are techniques. I mean, the CNU have developed these techniques which really work. Sorry, I always exaggerate a bit to make the point. But
I was struck by your comment that more than one, maybe 2, 3 of the students that you had previously been told, presumably by other professors, that they had no talent, or were not capable of studying architecture, and yet they proved to have a great deal to offer, and in one case you mentioned very successful now. It sort of prompts us to think about what do we mean by talent, and why those students might have been told that, and how did it turn out to be to their advantage. I wonder if you could comment more about that.
Well, I think one of the results of modern education is that often, because we are put into a school system which is kind of a universal education until 18, and then one is supposed to find out what one is good at, often ignoring the individual talents. Whereas, you put somebody on the piano or on a violin or with a hammer, and when he's 5 years old whether he's going to be a carpenter or the French minister tried to reform the system. What was his name? 5 years ago, he's a philosopher. He was minister. Luc Ferry. He talked on television about that he didn't want people just to sit in benches who hate benches because they have this talent. Everyone has some particular talent. Everyone. We're all born with some talent, unless we're completely invalidated or ill. But And all these talents are different. If they are not located, if you do the wrong job, you become a terribly unhappy person. And whereas when you do what you are good at, you can be the happiest person in the world, whether you are a carpenter or mathematical genius. But if you employ a mathematical genius to cook eggs, it's degrading. Where somebody is good at cooking, makes very good cooking, and every job has its decency and has its beauty and its honor, and it's an artisan society, which was, I think, was the way the world was organized. And unfortunately, mechanization has really torn that immediate identification of talent and jobs from us, and I think that's where the greatest problem lies. And people who look for themselves. What is that? I mean, trying to be there was this Woody Allen film Interiors where the wife wanted to be a writer, but she didn't know she was a pest. And the husband, after hours and hours of torture, he said, "Finally, tell me what you want to do. What is it you want?" And she says, "I want to express something, I don't know what." No. And that is the situation most people are in, because they are not in the right job. If you are in the right job, you know exactly what to do. And so it's identifying and these people who were really, had incredible skills. And this guy, he is an extraordinary talent. I'm sure he's going to become even famous, because it's a gift which is very rare. Be so both in the urban, to see the urban vision and then do the right detail, and but everyone has his talent. It's just today there's too little done in that direction, and that's the great thing, that talent is born every day. Modernism has not yet killed.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up or ask you about talent. How can a school, because you were saying that plasticity was so great about plasticity, it really can be taught. It can be taught not as a talent, but it can be taught as a technique or as a body, really rules and kind of methods. So how does talent come into an organized educational system? Is it as relevant or?
Even more relevant, because it's real talent to absorb these messages immediately. And like somebody who's really gifted for music, you show him something and because it's a natural thing which is related to the physiology and the mind, and whereas somebody, I mean, I've been playing the piano for 50 years, 60 years, and I'm missing that kind of talent. It doesn't prevent you from having enormous pleasure doing music, but you will never be like a real talent. And it's not forbidden to do something which you are not good at, but it's really the people who are talented must do the things they are good at to become really happy. Otherwise, they are forever frustrated. How to find out? That is, the artisan system was very good in finding out. You started with very simple tasks in the different branches, and then the talent naturally showed who masters what more quick, and then becomes actually a master. But thinking is another matter. There are very few people. The problem, for instance, with Corbusier was an enormous talent, yet this complete aberrant vision of town. And so it's not talent which necessarily leads you to do the right thing. You need some intellectual discipline so that talent finds a maximum way. In order to play really well a piano, you need also a very good instrument. So that's what would be the instrument which disciplines gives your talent a way to be much freer than a horrible instrument you have. It's much more difficult to be poetic.
The student who explored the Corbusier expressive work online, where he emerged with certain insights or from that experience. compared to the
It's much more difficult. Because Corbusier, he practiced like 6 different manieras, different, whether it was, he started as classical architect, and then concrete, beton brut style, and steel and glass, and ship style. And they are all, the different styles are not fully developed. And I think once you, for instance, his concrete style was very much influenced by Second World War defense architecture. Direct influences. But in order to make that into a language which could build more than a few buildings but make a town, you would have to be very systematic, and it's difficult to do that if you have not yet done the classical thing. And I'm trying to do that now because it's not easy. Because the thing is that it needs to be so general that it does not become, that it's not a personal language, but yet within this language structure, you are able to be a personality and speak it like with your own intonation and your own personality and your own temperament. But Corbusier was not a visionary in that sense that he didn't have a complete overview. Lang Wang, she was called. She tried to do that, but it's almost impossible. You can take some, Corbusier did some buildings like the Secretariat in Chandigarh, which are almost like a template of a whole architectural language in a single building, but doesn't make sense in a 300-meter long building. You can use that template of different openings and volumes and composition elements to make different buildings, but from there to do a whole town, you need to extend. But I think it should be done. Because classicism is developed. There's very little you can invent. Within classicism, you can have enormous amount of variations, as Duany has demonstrated with his heterodoxia volume. But modernism is not really developed as a language. There's very few moves, and but I think it should be done, and we are the ones who should do that, because it's really rendering it complex rather than simple-minded or becoming purely ironical or silly, as often modernism is, just making moves to make moves, trying to express something I don't know what. So a museum looks the same than the church and the same than the house, and it's all desperate searches for expression, but it's no expression really if you want to design the whole town. Imagine a whole town done by Peter Eisenman. I mean, it's unthinkable. Or Libeskind, that sort of thing. It's not that we don't want them to do the jobs. I mean, they have all the jobs in the world, but they're just not able to do it. So we have to do it.
One last question. David, sorry.
So my question was, when you do these urban developments like Guatemala and Ayala, how do you specifically address the mixture of classes? Because I would guess, like these new developments with beautiful architecture, great urbanism, the demand to live in these areas would be so high that don't you think it would affect the capability of lower classes living in these areas? And if so, like how would you address that?
It's when we started the family, the Leal family, they are very powerful. They own very large sugar interests and factories. So the family is basically interested in turning development to income. And it was very difficult to convince them that this should be an open development, not a gated community. And because they are very Christian, so I call on their Christian conscience. They become like Christian missionary, and you have to do something for this society. And it's true that because if the rich go on living in gated communities, the violence became so terrible that they will have another civil war within the next 2 or 3 generations. And the only way to integrate people and create structures where you allow the civic space to evolve is not that a private family wants to make a lot of money with development, is not going to build houses for the poor just because out of Christian feelings. No. So they build a town which will make maximum profit. That's what actually happens, makes a lot of money. But at least it's a town which represents what the town should be. And it has become a public space where when you go there, you find all classes coming. Because it's really a public space which is safe. And people can let their children out there without feeling threatened, which you can't do in other parts of town. But it's a model, and I think to really do a model how towns should develop must be a public project. Not meaning in the Soviet sense that the whole economy becomes a planned economy, but that the plan can be done by private consultants, but in the function of a public representative or public legislator who really represents public interest. And that's a certain amount of public space, a certain amount of uses of buildings which are symbols for not just for the rich, but also the poor and for all the different classes. And like that, slowly, you can again integrate societies which are now profoundly divided. I mean, in Colombia, you have zoning is zoned by income. Do you know South America? You know, in Medellin, you have zones which are only for high income, middle income, and one who has low income cannot be housed in a high income area. And the rich live in towers and the poor live in favelas. Incredibly, radically, brutally divided, and it's supposed to be a Christian society. And I think in that sense, there is a mission we are here in Catholic University, to see that as a mission of the Catholic, of those who practice Catholic. And I'm not practicing, but I was brought up Catholic. And I believe that that's one of the most important elements of the Christian culture, to have invented a town which is not divisive. Now think of you go to towns like Paris and that is a town where you can circulate, or where you used to be able to circulate in all the different avenues, whatever your income is. America was like 30 years ago, was very, it's difficult to realize how unsafe America was 30 years ago. You went to towns and you felt scared. You had to walk, you have to watch who walks on the other. I remember Sunday morning in Miami Beach, and feel threatened. Whereas you should be able to walk in town and feel safe. And that is why, in order for this to work, we have, in Kaela, we have very powerful police force, private police force. Because it has, the first years has to be very careful that no violence takes root there. So that people come there and feel safe, and that their children come for different purposes. And, so it's a model, I think, which is here in America is now has much changed. You feel much safer in cities now. But safe public space is a very, very precious good, which needs to be carefully planned. And therefore, it should not be too much space, otherwise you cannot manage it. It becomes too expensive. And the traditional form of streets and squares is about the right amount. You can pave well, you can police well, you can locate big and small lots as neighboring lots, and allowing society to function in an orderly way. But we had, there was an article in Huntington Post 3 years ago saying that we were just a town for the rich that was gated community, and the girl we wrote to her, this note, you got it wrong. They published it, and still the lie is being repeated that this is a gated community. Because there's a lot of, amongst critics, there's a lot of minding. When they see this type of architecture, they say it's for the rich. And they condemn it. When Norman Foster does buildings for the insanely rich, never gets criticized for that sort of thing. We are supposed to design for the rich because we have columns and bit of decoration. I mean, the towers, the pencil towers, which now go up in New York, they are for the indecently rich, the criminally rich. Never seen any criticism of the architecture method. It's for the rich. So it is, when you do classism, I think it's important that we know where we apply it, that it's not just everything is with columns, but we use decorative elements where they are the most meaningful. And this kind of idea of dosage, you know, that contrast, that what is highly decorous has to be in an environment which is much calmer in order to be powerful. Like a very powerful sound in a symphony is only powerful when it is accompanied by silence. It's around when you have this dynamic, which is of loud and of brutal and staccato and smooth and lento and so on. And by mixing all these qualities, you make a language which is expressive. That's what this is about.
I really appreciate your presentation. And at a certain point, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned the fact the need to develop a new Esperanto, a new international language. And looking at those examples that you showed us, designed by your students, I think those were exceptional, fantastic examples. And you proposed that they experiment 4 or 5 languages. As an academic project, I see that as an extreme.
It's an academic, yes.
I have a question. In regards to this international language, how does local typicality in architecture relate to that equation?
Well, with Richard, we designed this KLR really to have elements of Maya. You know, his steps are really Maya, strong Maya influence. But for instance, Maya influence, there is no architecture. There's no architecture to do town. It's a funeral. What survives the Maya architecture is all funerary architecture, and it's awesome. But you can't design town that way. Eh? Frank Lloyd Wright did a house like that, but it's like a tomb for the actress. What was his name? But it's very interesting. But I think our job is really to record local lexica differences and use them. Is that we should be polyglot. To speak different languages is considered like the sign of gentlemanly education. You know, it's good, but and we should be. And I think students are educated to be polyglot in architecture. And but also, I think it's very important that we are tolerant, that we are not fanatic, because the others are fanatic. And that democracy, we have enormous advantage of living in democracy, and that there is a choice. But that choice is not between skyscrapers and suburbia, is between different languages. And I say that because the modernists haven't developed the Esperanto, we have to do it, because we are capable of doing it. It does not mean that we should apply it everywhere, but when there's demand, why not? It's often more difficult to technically, it's often very insufficient to deal with climate, because flat roofs are good in Miami, but not so good, or in Sahara, but not so good in Swiss Alps. But that we need to be flexible and interested in many different languages. And when we go to Bhutan, we don't design buildings we would design in Paris. I think that's a common agreement, and there's now a technique how to do that. This lexical approach is fantastically powerful. It can be done very quickly.
Thank you again.
Thank you.